A big thanks to Gymnastic Planet for supporting this episode. Gymnastics is a challenging sport, but having the right tools in your gym bag really does help. Gymnastic Planet is a leading manufacturer and distributor of essential training kit. They provide the best quality products, including world-class speed equipment, handguards, and chalk. They also specialise in club services like venue design, maintenance, and installation. Backed by decades of experience, from competing and coaching to club management, Gymnastic Planet aims to help gymnasts succeed and enjoy their craft. If you'd like to find out more, visit gymnasticplanet.com. In 2019, Dan Lonsdale launched his gymnastics strength and conditioning business, which now supports over 10 gymnastics clubs across the UK and Europe. He had previously worked as a senior strength and conditioning coach at Durham University, working with their top performance athletes. Dan also provides coach education, focusing on S&C, specifically for gymnastics, alongside sharing his knowledge at coaching workshops and seminars. Gymnastics is a sport that is constantly evolving, and the work that Dan provides is incredibly valuable, and this is his story. That sound all right, Dan?
Yeah, sounds
I
good.
probably missed out the rugby thing, right? You've done a lot of work in rugby as well.
That's all good.
Yeah? How are
Yeah.
you, mate? Thanks for coming on. Just tell us a bit about, I guess, what you've been up to. You said that you'd been working 4 days already this week.
Yeah.
So is that a normal week for you?
Yeah, it is, yeah. It's it never used to be a normal week, like 4 visits on the thing, but yeah, it's been busy. It's sort of coming off the back of these competitions, so you're trying to get everyone going and create structures and lots of meetings again. But it's been a good week. It's just,
Do you enjoy that travelling time, Dan? Is that a lot of the time when you do a lot of your thinking and you're kind of planning and getting those sessions done?
I get asked that a lot actually as well, of like, how do you do so much travelling? But anyone who kind of does it, you eventually get used to it quite quickly, and then eventually you do sort of look forward to the time in the car, just time to think and get things done. And you know, I speak to my family probably more than I ever have as well now.
Really? Wow.
Just use it as a time to like ring them and speak to everyone, and because I'm in the car for 2.5 hours.
Yeah,
so.
it's one thing I've always loved about driving. When I was training, because you kind of have to focus on driving. But also at the same time, it's one of those tasks that is somewhat monotonous, so you can think about things that you need to do. And for me, like, I can't go on emails, and I can't.
Nope.
You can call someone, but I'm so untech savvy that I'd never set up hands-free on my car. So I'd just be in the car.
Just
so
you.
I can't. So I really enjoy that time. And I imagine probably for someone that does so much travelling and is going to training sessions, that's probably when you come up with some of your best ideas.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it lets me reflect on how the session's gone as well. So on the way there, I don't really think about the work, if I'm being honest. But on the way back, I'll definitely be reflecting on like, oh, I should have done that, or could have done this better, or that went quite well, or should have had that conversation a bit better. So it does actually give you time to reflect. And I try and use it like that as well. So by the time I get home, I can get in the house and stop.
Yeah. Do you have a strategy for collating that information and that reflection? Because that's one thing maybe I struggle with. And I've started doing it a bit more when I work at the gym at Knott's on a Thursday. If you're in the gym, the guys that train, they'll see me with my little notepad.
Yeah, I've seen it.
But it's just so I don't forget.
It's
so I don't forget.
Yeah.
And then what I did do after this 3-month preparation, I then went back to all of those notes and wrote them all down and then gave them over to the guys. So they could see that those observations that I made, specifically when it came to technique things. They could look back to January and kind of almost correlate that with the training that they had and then the competition results and stuff. So, but it's more for me because if I don't write it down, you know, I'll have these ideas after the session and then 2 days later they're gone. You know, they're in the ether somewhere. So do you have any systems for kind of doing that, or is it just...
So like when I first started, I had a pretty good internship at Durham Uni, and it was through also like an external company as well, and they made us very reflective practitioners like quite quickly. But we had to fill out like charts and stuff after every session. And I think what it was, I used to hate it. When I first started doing it, it was just long and it took a long time. But what it does eventually is now you can just reflect without having
the framework.
Yeah, so as you become more of an experienced coach over time, you just don't have the framework, but you can reflect. And then since I've been doing my gymnastics, I try and sort of do it on 3 main pillars that I sort of run my business off, which is encourage, enhance, and protect. So like, have I been encouraging this session? Yes, no. If not, why? Have I managed to enhance performance in some way or shape or form? If not, why? And then obviously, have I managed to like protect or sort of mitigate the risk of an injury or, you know, with it? And I sort of use those 3 questions, and they're not always yes, but it just allows me to at least distill it in my head and then just ask myself those questions.
Yeah, sounds really smart, mate. That sounds really clever to have something that you've got as almost a benchmark.
Yeah, we used to have like these, like it was like 15, 16 points when I was first learning, but I would say like distill it to 3 things that you actually care about as well. Things I didn't care about on the old reflections.
Because it can't be a chore either. You need to like enjoy the process of reflection, right?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Dan, when you look back, what were some of the kind of like the key components in your life that led you to becoming a strength and conditioning coach?
That's a good question. So I used to go to a sport where school where we used to do loads of sport.
Okay.
And I actually had like a really encouraging rugby coach. So I was really fortunate. I had a fabulous coach growing up, just really supportive. And his brother was the strength and conditioning coach from Man City Football Club.
Wow, really?
And that was the first time I ever heard of it. So it was Chris Webb was my rugby coach and his brother, John. And when he said he was an S&C coach for football, I was like, I don't even know what that is. Like, but when I found out, it's basically, in my head, that you do gym with athletes, I was like, that's quite fun. That's what I'm going to do. So I knew quite quickly from like 16, I was like, that's what I'm going to do.
Okay.
So yeah, that's what sort of got me to that, like, I want to be a strength and conditioning coach, that guy there, yeah.
And when you go down that road, what does that look like, Dan? Is that very much a traditional, let's go to university and study?
Yeah, so I had to work backwards. So what does an S&C coach need? Well, they need a degree in sports science. The traditional model is a degree in sports science. Normally there's an internship involved at some point, so you actually gain experience. And then after that, it's trying to get, obviously, into the job market as well. So, yeah, I tried pretty hard at my A-levels and managed to get the things I needed to get to uni. I went to Edinburgh University for 4 years. You do 4 years just because it's a Scottish university. And then I came out and I actually went back home and I did an internship at Durham University. Okay. And then luckily, after my internship, I was sort of fortunate enough to be kept on a year's contract. And then after the year's contract, I was kept on for 4.
And what were those first bits of work that you did, and what sports were they in? Was it, I know you worked at the university, was that multi-sport?
Yeah, so the university setting it's really interesting. It's changed a lot. So it's performance sport. So they all have head coaches and physios and nutritionists and psychologists, and a lot of them are there on scholarships. Okay. And there's this big league table, so Bucks is, if you ever want to look into it, it's called Bucks, and they play every Wednesday. And if you're a certain level, that it's outstanding. So yeah, it's really, really interesting. But it was multi-sport. So in my first year, I was basically given the athletes or the sports that people didn't want.
Okay.
So I won't say what they were, but yeah, I was working with. I was working with a couple of triathletes. There was a women's team, like a second team hockey, that the coach was clearly just like keeping an eye on me for doing. It wasn't anything too serious. And then in my second year, I actually got given the job of being lead S&C coach for Durham University rugby team, right? Which is pretty prestigious, yeah. 70 lads.
Was once you had that spark of inspiration, from your rugby coach's brother that was at Man City, did you have a plan in terms of what sport you wanted to go into? Or at that point, was it just, I just want to work in sport? Yeah,
it was rugby.
Right, okay.
Yeah, it was just like, I'd done that silly thing of sort of saying, like, I'm a rugby guy and that's what I'm going to do and I'm going to do rugby. And I ended up doing it for 9 years, right? So even when I came to Nottingham, I ended up doing rugby as well with Nottingham Trent. But I've literally been on something recently talking about trying not to give yourself that title because actually you close your mind off to other things. Right. So, like you said, I work in gymnastics now. So,
what was that initial experience of working in rugby like? Obviously, had you played since you were a kid?
Yeah, I'd played. So
you knew the sport well.
Yeah, I was used to the culture. I think that's probably the thing that people would find interesting is the culture is very different to some other sports where it can be sometimes a bit over the top and a bit. But I was used to it because I played it, and then it took a while to get used to. I was in charge. I was 23, I think, and I was in charge of 70 young rugby players. In a program that produced 4 professional rugby players year on year. But the people that were leaving were about 2 years younger than me, right? It was really interesting because I was just growing up myself, really, trying to then make sure that these guys were doing the right things and turning up on time. And it was interesting.
What was some of those, when you look back now at that experience, when you're 23 and those guys are 20, 21, what were some of the early mistakes you made in terms of because you felt potentially that you needed to be a certain way because you were like, how are these guys? Because you see that quite often in sport, right? If someone comes in and they're young, I've seen it in gymnastics a lot, particularly with, there's a role that is so the youngest guys that are on the GB team, that role is quite often given to somebody that's maybe been in the sport for 15, 20 years as an athlete, recently retired, got their first qualification badges, and they get put in that role. And straight away you can see they're like, I've not done any coaching. How is anybody going to trust what I've got to say? And it's really interesting from afar watching how they, I guess, decide to pitch themselves almost.
Figure it out,
and get that right. Do they go in there going, right, I don't know anything, I'm here to learn too? Or do they go in saying, right, I know everything, you listen to me? That must be a difficult thing to figure out when you're a young man yourself.
It's usually the latter, right? It's, you puff your chest out and you try and sort of ego your way through it. and I, like, initially that's what I thought would probably make me successful, but I was pretty lucky. I had good mentors who'd done that job for a long time. So you soon realise that the lads aren't particularly bothered about who can bench press more or who can squat more, or, you know, if you're going to tell them off all the time. What they care about is actually if you're a good coach. So after that year of sort of like pushing and pulling with them constantly, which is what it felt like, was just trying to put standards in place, and when they didn't, kicking off. And you eventually just realise, like, show some compassion, show you care, care outside the sport, because obviously they're doing a degree at Durham, so that's tough. You know, if you're an engineer, you're doing 12 exams in Christmas and 12 in summer, and then just making sure that you're doing a good job by them, so you're getting them to where they want to go. So they were coming to Durham to get a degree, but lots of lads were also coming to Durham to get a degree and a contract. So it was making sure you were trying to get the lads there in the best possible place. And as soon as I did that, completely different change.
How important are those communication skills and empathy in a job like yours, where you're not necessarily... So the main coach is going to be the coach that's teaching them to do rugby. You're somebody that sits on the side and focuses on a specific part of their physiology and their game. And quite often those athletes will come to somebody that's on the sports medicine side of things, and they'll treat you like a barman, right? And they'll share their struggles and their worry, and how important is that part of it? And did it take you a little bit of time to realise, wow, a big part of what I'm doing actually is just sitting and listening? Yeah,
I think that was a big part of me sort of growing up into my job and role. Is so by the end of Durham, I'd realised that was probably the main part of the job. The weights were going to lift themselves, the exercises were the exercises, but it was just taking the time to speak to the lads if they had stuff to talk about. And they definitely come to you, because they're not going to go to the head coach, because why would you go and complain to the person who picks the team or puts your routine together about their routine or not being picked? Because you know for a fact your routine won't get changed, and they're not going to pick you for the next game if you're complaining in your head as an athlete. So they come to you because they know that actually I don't really dictate what happens on a Wednesday or what happens on a competition day, really. So.
I've always been fascinated, Dan. This question's just come to me, because this must happen when someone like you is in the role that you are, sitting within a team sport. An athlete must come to you at times and complain about decisions that are made or other athletes' results, and then you'll get another athlete come and do the same thing about that athlete.
Same thing.
And how difficult is it to just kind of sit there, smile, remain impartial? And cause that's quite a challenge, right? Because that must happen all the time. Because if they're sharing that information, I used to do it. You know, I'd be sat on the physio bed getting massaged for an hour, and I'm just But everybody must be doing exactly the same thing. That's a lot of information that's coming your way, right?
Yeah, it's a lot. Like you said, you can't be emotionally invested in it. And what I mean by that is, like, you can't have a favourite and go like, oh no, you should definitely be in the team. And you should be in the team, because at the end of the day, you're working with lads that are 130 kilograms. They all have professional contracts already, so they're all clearly at a level. So what you're trying to do is sort of say, like, well, have you thought about thinking about it this way, or have you actually had the conversation with the coach? So what I used to try and do is just sort of say, like, these are all valid points, what you're saying, but they're all valid points to your S&C coach. You know, like, how do we take that information and how do you present that to the head coach, who had also been, you know, he'd played for Saracens and he was that fiery red character. And it was like, how do we, you know, take that information but take it to him like this? So it was almost trying to help them construct their conversation where it wasn't like, why are you not picking me? And because if you do that, you're just not going to pick. So,
have you seen, Dan? Have you seen people in your line of work? Have you seen people overstep that mark? So I've experienced
Probably,
it.
yeah.
I can remember being at a World Championships, so very highest level, and we were in a situation where we were under the cosh, and a physio stepped in and started giving technical advice, gymnastics advice to an athlete just before they went up.
Wild, yeah.
I kind of think, what are you doing?
Yeah, crazy.
And then we had a conversation afterwards, and then, then there was some communication between the medical team saying, look, you can't do that under pressure. That's
scary,
but you must have seen that, right?
I can imagine you do, yeah. So in rugby, it's a little bit different because you run the water on game day, for example. So you have like an earpiece and you run it on, and the coach is telling you what to say. So you're almost the deliverer of the message because they get the bigger picture, and then you're the ones that are... That's why the water goes on and so much in rugby is they're not thirsty. They need the message. I haven't seen anyone do it, but I was in an environment where that just wasn't done. Durham University, second every year, number one team sport for God knows how long. That just isn't... Because the coaches you were working with, ex-GB, ex-Saracens, ex-England cricketer, so Foxy, it was just... You don't need to give technical advice around those guys. And if you did, I think they'd tell you quite quickly.
Yeah, you'd learn
only do it
fast,
once.
Right?
Yeah.
How did you then, Dan, go from... Was there a point in your career working within rugby where you thought, do you know what, I want to try something different? Or this might not be for me right now?
Yeah.
What was that made you think and pivot?
Yeah.
And then how did you then find the sport of gymnastics?
That's a good question. So how I found the sport of gymnastics, when I was at Durham Uni, we set up an institute called the Durham Institute of Sport. I'm not quite a proud northerner, so you can tell by the accent of... I was getting quite frustrated of young athletes probably not getting the support they needed in the northeast. People might disagree with that, but it's true. So in conjunction with the council and the uni, what I did is I set up a scheme with my mentor where we would provide free strength and conditioning support, free psych support, free coach education, and discounted physio for athletes in the region that were of a certain level. You had to apply. Regional and up was the rule. So we had all sorts apply from taekwondo champions all the way through. And one of them was a club rang us from the northeast and in the Durham region, basically saying we have some athletes here that do get support, but obviously, the support's a little bit different in gym, isn't it? Because it's not centralised.
Yeah.
We'd like you to come and provide some. And then that was it. I turned up to the club. That was my first time in a gymnastics club, by the way. I'd never...
What year was this, Dan?
It was 3 years out from Rio.
Okay,
2 years out from Rio, yeah.
2014?
Gosh, yeah. So, yeah, it's all blurring in now. But turned up and just... My first day was definitely just watching. I had a list of exercises and then I watched a 10-year-old do a backflip. Slowly just folded up my list of exercises and put it in my back pocket because I was like, this isn't the one. This isn't the answer. I think this child's got split squat sorted. So, and then because they were already in the GB setup, obviously the head of S&C comes in and you have a chat, and it was just getting going and starting.
Who was the head at the time? Was it Rudy?
It's Rudy, yeah. So Rudy came in and he was just sort of saying...
I guess you're talking about the gym where Amy would have been training for Rio, right?
Yeah.
So high-level athletes.
Would have been up that way, yeah. And because they were in the region, so... And that's how I got into gym, and then that's how I met Nick as well. So obviously me and Nick are good mates, but he's also been somewhat of a mentor in terms of my gymnastics knowledge. And I had to spend... we'd go there every Friday, but I'd spend more and more time there on a Friday. I was only meant to be there an hour for work. I was there for 4 or 5, just watching, learning, asking questions. And
what an amazing scheme that was. Was that funded by the council?
Council and the university together.
Oh, that's amazing.
Because they were sending, what they did is the council funded it. That paid for a strength and conditioning coach, which was me. And then they would then send their S&C coaches and bring their staff in. So we'd do education days for their staff. It was great. It was
that's amazing.
And it was full. So yeah, we had...
Does that still continue now?
Yeah, still going.
Really?
Yeah, we had
awesome.
we had Tinks, but then we also, we had Zone S, Scotland international footballer. Like you said, we had 3 taekwondo brother and sisters that were all world champions, kickboxers that were world champions. It was the talent that came out to that scheme was unbelievable. Fencers. It was scary how much talent there was in the northeast.
When you first came in, Dan, you go into that environment and you put your piece of paper in your back pocket once you've seen a 10-year-old do a backflip.
Through it.
Because I think people that haven't seen gymnastics, when they see it live for the first time, they're like, how on earth has that child just done that? You can't comprehend how you get from just not being able to do anything to be doing that at 10 years old.
Yeah.
When you see that, is your initial response, right, okay, I need to learn a lot and I need to learn like quite quickly in order to be able to help these athletes?
Yeah.
Because I've watched sports medical team staff from all different areas kind of approach coming into the sport in very different ways. And the best ones have come in and just sat and watched.
Yeah.
And I think I had a physio in the lead up to Rio, a guy called Nathan Ring, who he was the best because for the first 6 months, and he was based at Lilleshall, he would just come into the gym every day and just sit there in the gym.
Just watch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was so helpful for the athletes because the time it takes for me to communicate to a strength and conditioning coach, a physio, a sports psychologist, what a Kovac is on high bar.
Yeah.
And for them to be able to see it in their head, okay, I know what he's doing, so this is what's happening to his body. This is where he's getting the pain. And for them to understand that quick, I need you to learn as fast as possible. Yeah. Is that kind of the approach you went for when you first came into it? Yeah.
I do that with all sports as well. Right. So, I learned it quick at university, like hockey environments or netball. You just have to go watch it and learn it. You can't get them to tell you because it's always never going to be... Through the athlete's eyes is very different to what actually is happening sometimes as well. Some athletes do things without even realising they're doing it, right? The best ones. Lots of watching, lots of listening, lots of asking questions. Like, I'm naturally quite curious, so ask the questions the right way, I guess. But, and then obviously Nick started to do some work there as well. And he was very similar, so he was very interested in strength and conditioning.
Okay.
So what happened quite quickly is it was like, well, let's swap this information over. But he would make me, I'd have to sit and watch like flips and twists into the pit, for example, because I didn't know what happened when an athlete went upside down. I'd never had one that had gone upside down before, and if he had, we had problems because they weren't meant to be. So, and I'd have to figure it out because it was like white noise. They'd run, they'd go upside down, I wouldn't see anything, and then they would hit the floor again, and then I could figure out what was going on once the feet were on the floor. I didn't understand when an athlete went upside down, let alone starting to twist. So I think he figured it out quite quickly, and he was like, you need to watch this. And
what were some of your initial observations of the sport when you saw it? What were the first things that stuck out to you?
The first one was just the level of conditioning was... There's conditioning going on all the time. Some of it, I'm always like, is this too much? But there was the athletes are like highly conditioned for their sport. They're very fit, they're very strong. The core is unbelievable. Right from a young age, they're working on those things, and I think that's something that I sort of realised quite quickly. It's like lots of sports could probably try and work a little bit harder at some stuff at a younger age. But then there was some other observations that there's some strategies of bits and bobs, like a little bit of stretching or the level of impact. So like obviously S&C coaches are very hot on how much impact you should do and how quickly. And you look at it and you're like, wow, this sport demands a lot of impact of the athlete. We have to come up with some solutions quite quickly to get them to cope with this. Because if you don't cope with it, you're not going to, well, we know, don't you? You're not going to go too far. So... Yeah, the observations were just thick and fast. They were really, really interesting.
Was there anything in particular when you first started that you looked at and went, okay, there's an area here where I feel like I can provide some real value and there's a real gap in the knowledge of this community that I'm working into. I think that's where I'm going to focus on.
Yeah, I think that was more when I'd left and I'd stayed sort of in touch with obviously Nick, and we were doing work loosely. And then when I set up my consultancy, I sort of realised quite quickly, I was like, strength training is something that there isn't much knowledge on in this sport. I think people are doing it. I think they're not doing it in a structured way or the correctly coached way, and there's a lot of fear about using weights. And so that was my first thing that I saw, where I was like, actually, this is probably my first win or my first in with the coaches. Right. It wasn't going in and changing, cultural things that have been there for years. It was going in and actually providing some value to begin with, rather than going in and going, don't do that, that's wrong, don't do that. I just don't think you're going to last in any environment when you do that. But if you go in and go, if we get them stronger, they can cope with more, or they can produce more skills, or I think that's an easy win.
How difficult is it when you go into a brand new sport and you don't necessarily have the credibility in that area to convince people to get on board?
Yeah.
And how hard is that mentally in terms of your mindset when you've been successful in another sport, you go into a brand new one, you're trying to tell, look, I know what I'm talking about, and they're like, well, where's the evidence?
Yeah, show us.
And how strong do you have to be mentally to believe in your own ability and what you are bringing to the table?
Yeah, you've just got to be, obviously we're backed by science, so you're reading, I read like 10, 20 journals like monthly, just trying to get the knowledge in still. So you know that this stuff works. It's just more, I also see it as like a strategy of trying to get them to know that this stuff works. So it's more just letting people give you a chance to do it. I'm quite lucky because obviously I have a consultancy, so the people want me to go into the gym to do it.
They're seeking you.
Yeah. Rather than me being put into that environment. I think that's very challenging because you're not in charge of the coach that you work with or the athletes you work with or the environment that you're in. Where the people who ring me and say, oh, do you want to come and do a visit or do you want to work with us monthly? They want me to come in. So then there's something there.
They're bought in already.
Yeah, they know that there's something there. When I first started, though, like you said, there was no reputation in gymnastics, really. So it was just going with an open mind of, I've seen the sport for a while and I've learnt off some good coaches that have taught me some really good technical skills. It's like, let me try and do this. And then once you pick up one club, you pick up two and then three. And then you just got to make your own success in that sport. No one's bothered about, 4 rugby players on year average for 4 years. It just doesn't relate, does it?
Yeah.
It's a different sport.
What were some of the big challenges initially when you got into the sport, Dan? What were some of the things that you were like, this is going to be hard to get over this barrier? Not necessarily for yourself, but more for I guess I'm going to change that question. What were some of the attitudes within gymnastics that you found challenging to break down when you first got into it?
I think it was probably more is sometimes better. So just the volume of work of if we do more, we will improve, particularly around conditioning, where sometimes it was just looking at like, actually, if we do the right things at the right times, we can prepare the athletes and give them the best opportunity to not have a lot of fatigue or give them the best opportunity to produce the skills when we need them, as opposed to like, we need everything now. I'm really lucky the clubs that I work at are super sensible and quite self-selected like that. But yeah, that was the big challenge. There's a lot of stuff going on where sometimes I was like, you could probably not do all of that impact today and keep it for the rest of the week and use it later in the week. So that was probably the biggest impact of like trying to not do as much stuff that I don't think was going to have an impact and do more things that are going to have an impact with the gymnasts.
What were some of those early wins, Dan, that then translated into people kind of taking notice and going, okay, this guy does know what he's talking about. I can see the progress.
Yeah.
Let's buy in. Let's double down on this.
Yeah. Structuring your strength and conditioning. So have set days where you do set things. Make sure you have a plan. Make sure that plan is evolving throughout the year. Make sure you're progressing the athletes. Make sure you're progressing the athletes that aren't just the best ones in the group. Try and progress the ones that are maybe struggling a little bit as well, because you want to take your whole group and develop them physically. You don't just want like the runaways to go for it and then everyone else to stay there. So it was that really of creating a structure where everyone in that group can perform things that are going to make them adapt and get physically better. And then that gives the gymnast and the coaches the best chance to do their thing. Right. So you're trying to make a bigger ball of clay.
Right.
And then it's up to the coach to mould that into whatever they want. So it's just trying to give them a bigger surplus of it. Yeah.
I spoke to Josh, Dan, yesterday, and I said, I'm having a chat with Dan tomorrow.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you would ask him? And he said, ask him whether or not there are any clubs that he works with, and you obviously don't name any clubs, or in the past, a club you've been to and visited where you've felt like they're just ticking a box here. They're not actually bought into this. It's just almost, right, S&C, I have to do that, so let's do it, but we don't necessarily know why we're doing it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I think so. Like, there's certain places where I've gone and you can tell they kind of know they need it, but they don't know why.
Is that your job then?
It then becomes an educational thing, yeah. So you go and they know they need it because they've almost been told, and the message has been quite out there now, hasn't it, for a while, of this stuff is important and it's going to protect them. So they know they need it, but they don't know why. So you go and you sort of have to say, let's do some coach education as well as working with the gymnasts, because I think sometimes everyone wants you to just go and work with the gymnasts, where I think providing the education and letting it filter down is really important as well. So making sure you have that coach education element to to what you're doing. So whenever I go in and I get a sense of that, I'm a bit like, let's get some education bubbling on the other side of this, so then actually we can change it. Because it's with the best will in the world, but then it's like, well, do you know what I'm going to do? Like, what's the plan? Like, so, and then if people aren't really sure as well, it's up to me to also create that structure as well. So one thing I'll do when I'll first go into a club is try and structure what they're doing, create a structure and a framework at least, so then they have a plan. Yeah. You know, and then once they've got a structure, at least they're doing something structurally in the week, and then over the months or years, you can figure it out, depending on how long you last. Yeah.
Have you ever been into an environment within sport, not just in gymnastics, where you've gone, this isn't right for me? Yeah. And you've gone, okay, thanks guys, but it's just right now that setup, it just doesn't work with me. And then what is your perfect relationship with an environment that you go into?
Yeah, there's probably a couple of sports, because obviously at university level you work with like every sport you can imagine, really. I used to struggle. I struggle with football a little bit. I love football, but I just struggle with it a little bit, in the sense of sometimes working hard can be seen as not cool when they're a little bit younger, and and that's not really my.
So is it more? Really is it more than like when you're trying to get the young kids on board, they're playing that? Yeah, I don't need to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, or like we'd go and do some warm ups with. We'd have like a professional team on campus up north, and you'd have to go out and do some warm ups every now and then and stuff, and it was just like the constant heckling, and just do it properly then, you know, like you're all saying your back's hurt, but you're not warming up properly before you go train. And it's like, so for me, I sort of probably am quite suited to gymnastics, if like people do things properly and they want to do things properly. And I think that actually, I've weirdly sort of found a sport where I think like that suits me as well. Like do things properly or don't do it at all. But yeah, like the footy thing, it's half and half. Kind of love it, kind of don't, like, but yeah, just.
What are those? What are the clubs that you're working with that you enjoy the most? Yeah. What are those things that you're looking for? What is that relationship like with the coaches, the athletes, the whole club, and I guess the atmosphere that you feel when you walk into that space?
You want to feel welcome, because you are genuinely a stranger in that place. So, you know, you take Notts, for example, like every gymnast will say hello, every male gymnast will come greet you with a handshake. It's just like a done thing, which I'm sure you're well aware of. And that small things like that make a big difference. I don't think people realise when you're not from that environment and you're there once a month or twice a month, that makes a big difference of just someone being quite welcoming and asking how you're doing. But in terms of the environments where I really like to work, it's wherever I'm integrated with the coach. So I work side by side with the coach, and you ask questions and they ask questions, or, you know, they're challenging bits and bobs, and they can say, oh, look at this, and can you figure this out? Or I think it's those where it's very like on the coach's shoulder, working alongside the coach. The environments I don't like as much, should be really clear, is like where it's very siloed. So you work here in the fitness gym and we work in here in the gymnastics club. I just don't, that isn't my model that I think works. I believe in like a fully integrated approach, which is why I go to gymnastics clubs for like 6 hours. I don't go there for an hour. I go there for 6 because I want to be in the session.
Have you noticed a difference, Dan? Is there a difference between working, and what are the differences physically and psychologically between working with male athletes and female athletes?
Yeah, I think so. I think at university level, it probably equals out a little bit more as they're obviously developing into young adults. They sort of, you get the ones that aren't nice, male or female, and the ones that are nice, and the male environment can sometimes be a bit more about their ego, and you've got to just make sure that you don't spark that too much, otherwise you lose the athlete. Similarly with good female athletes, you've got to be careful that you're not seen to just be like not listening or disrespecting them, or so that can spark quite quickly in like a young adult. I think in gymnastics, it's more the group environment's the best thing to watch, of like a group of WAG that are amazing, a group of MAG that are amazing. But if you watch them like warm up, or if you gave them the opportunity to do whatever they wanted for 10 minutes, I can imagine what they would choose would be quite different.
What would you imagine they would choose?
WAG would be quite structured and probably what they think they should be doing. the boys, I don't know.
They'd probably just play hand tennis, wouldn't they?
Hand tennis, wrestle.
Go on trampoline. Like,
yeah, you'd
be more play. You'd be more
concerned in terms of, as an S&C coach, what they go and do, because there would be an element of risk to it. But that would be my only observation. It's quite a light-hearted one, really, of like, it probably makes them great at what they do anyway.
Yeah.
And that's why they are like that. But yeah, if you allowed it, it wouldn't be an experiment I'd run at a gym, but it would be interesting to see.
Do you think the age at which male and female gymnasts typically compete at the highest level plays a major factor in the way they approach training?
Yeah.
In terms of how, because when female athletes talk about male gymnasts, like, you guys are so relaxed and you just take it so easy, and then when male athletes, you guys are so structured, it's so strict. Do you think that the ages at which they have to compete at the highest level plays a real key role in that?
Yeah. Time just puts pressure on everything, doesn't it? You know, days before a comp, weeks before a comp, years before an Olympics, it's whatever that is going to put pressure on. So yeah, if you have less time, I think the perception is like you have to start now and go quick. And but I think the sport's changing. I think, isn't it, as people are like sort of competing for longer. And you said last time, I hate the word, but like doing it for as long as they want to do it, which I think is the key thing. So I think hopefully that pressure of like time's running out is slowly expanding a little bit more to like actually what is an average athlete lifespan, which is quite cool. Yeah. Do you know, rather than like being old in your 20s, which you're not old in your 20s, you're just getting going, right? So even athletically, you're just getting started. So yeah, I think it's quite cool that we're every Olympics, it's always like I'm looking for like the oldest athlete there just to see where we are. And I think it's nice to see that it's stretching this way. It's not staying down the bottom end, because it removes the pressure. It removes pressure from the coaches, removes the pressure from the parents, from the athletes, whatever is creating the pressure. It just nullifies it a little bit, doesn't it? What do you think?
I would say the same, mate. I think that it definitely is stretching out. I think even the conversations that are taking place within the community is very important as well, because you mentioned it a little bit. I can't remember whether we were talking, or it was before we went live, about the attitudes towards weight training in gymnastics. I remember when I was a kid, everyone said you can't weight train when you're 14 because it will damage all your growth plates and your bones and stuff. Small. That was just the attitude. So no one just lifted weights. Again, 23 is your peak. So in my head, 23 is my peak. So as soon as I'm a day over 23, that's it. I'm on the way out. And I can remember having a conversation with Ellie when she was 23, and I pulled her to one side. I said, Ellie, just so you know, if someone had told me when I was 23 that I was still super young in the sport, I had years ahead of me, it would change the way I approach the next 4 years. And she was like, oh, thanks for that. I appreciate it, because I feel 23, especially for a female athlete as well, I feel like this is the end now, because that's the messaging that you kind of get. So I do agree, mate. And I definitely noticed a toning down of the intensity top down within the women's side. It's definitely like...
Cool. That's great.
Smoother.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah.
From what I see in my club, but that's isolated. You would probably you'd be able to see that across, you work with over 10 clubs, right? So you'd see that more, but I've definitely noticed that. Whether or not that is through the fact that the system's being forced to do that or not, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter, because even if it is just because purely you're being watched. So the culture's got to change a little bit. You'll get a positive end result. So that's a good thing for me. I think seeing someone like Becky, obviously in her 30s. Still going, trying to compete in Olympic Games is great, right? Seeing Max in his 30s, gone to 4 Olympics, same thing. Because
same thing.
That 23-year-old thing, it just doesn't...
It's a myth, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just... It was not backed up by any evidence. And what's quite interesting is, for someone like you, what you said, you come in with this science and this evidence, and there's not a lot of that in gymnastics, and there wasn't when I was growing up. It was these old kind of... I just get messaging that has been passed down over generations, right? And a lot of it was people coming in from Eastern Europe, where it's a very different culture. And they have hundreds of athletes that they can just... say if one's injured, the next one's in. So a very different culture. And you can't really do that here, right? Because we don't have that many athletes. We have to look after them. And that's probably a big part of your job, right? Is looking after those athletes. So I agree, mate, that I do think it is certainly changing, and that long-term, I think in anything, just a long-term approach makes a huge difference in how you execute being an athlete, as a coach, the whole performance team, the setup. It does make a big difference.
Yeah, of course. You had just, again, it just expands the length of time, doesn't it? But like, you look at the weight training thing, for example, absolute myth of like, but you can see, like, 'cause I definitely had that asked of me when I was younger, in terms of like when I started to train weights or whatever, just recreationally, and then, but you start to read the research and it gets released, and it's like, actually, if we're doing this at the right times, this is actually actively good for athletes. It's actually brilliant for female athletes because it reduces the risk of osteoporosis later down the line. So, you know, it can increase bone mineral density. It can, you know, help you cope with forces. So when you're landing, your bones bend, and they naturally do. But, you know, it can make them more resilient to that, rather than it being this constant like pounding through a tissue. And it's like, all of that is through weight training. And then you look at the other side of it, it's dangerous. And it's like, well, okay, from a science background, you look at the research and it's like, well, the research actually states that it's only dangerous when it's not taught or it's not observed being done. That's when the most risk of injury happens. And then when you compare it to actual sports, the research is like, the sports are actually the highest risk of injury, whether that be rugby, gymnastics, American football, but the risk is higher. And I think it's because when I'm doing the strength and conditioning with athletes, it's like, you know, I have 4 or 5 here, and you have to make it just very controlled. There's no craziness going on at all, you know. So, but again, that's that educational side. You go in, and if people don't know that and they have those worries, it's not almost being like, well, the research says it's fine. It's stupid. It's like, well, let's have a chat and let me show you this and explain why it's almost better. Because every coach wants the best for an athlete. So if you're saying it's going to increase their bone mineral density later down the line, and they're like, well, what's that? And it's like, well, if you think of a sponge, you get more hexagons in a sponge in your bone. It makes you healthier. It's like, every coach wants that for athletes, just to be better, healthier, last longer, feel better.
What are some of the most common injuries that you come across in gymnastics, Dan, that you feel like are the easiest to prevent if the coaches and the teams and the clubs were to have that access to that knowledge?
Yeah, I think the tricky point, isn't it, is that in gym you're working with athletes that are developing and going through like peak height velocity. So when people really start to shoot up, and obviously that happens for boys and girls at different times. And then it's, what do you do to sort of get them through that period without picking up these sort of like overuse injuries, because you're more susceptible to injury in that time? It's hard. You know, I don't think anyone's cracked it just yet, but it's just being really mindful of that workload when that athlete is growing, you know.
How do you know that? You know, as a coach,
tough, so tough.
Can you be like measuring their height and you can like see when they have a growth spurt? Because that's a hard thing to...
Yeah, and it's hard, isn't it? Because culturally, you know, there's things in place now where performance staff can only be taking measurements. You know, they've released it recently, which is great. But it's almost probably having something in place in your gym, like as a, you know, someone who is a performance staff who could do that for you. Okay. But yeah, you know, a height is a basic measurement, and I don't think that's. But you know, that will give you a rough idea of, well, if you've grown like 5 centimeters in 2 months, you're growing quite quickly. So, but it's really tough. But like you said, you see, like, obviously, you know, we get Osgoods and Severs, and then, you know, it sort of finishes up with a bad back sometimes as well, and it's just that workload while they're growing to really, really tough.
Is that what you're doing? You're then looking at managing the workload? Are you managing the type of work they're doing? Or?
Yeah, it's having a conversation with the coaches as well, because they're the ones that control the mainstay of the workload, right? They're in charge of the ship, really. So it's just trying to have the conversation, and as long as you have a good relationship with these coaches, they'll listen. It doesn't mean that they change everything you say, but it's mainly just like making you aware of, or, you know, I'm observing this, or I've been told this, or it's just making sure that you have that good That's almost my job, to have that relationship with the coach, to say, you know, I'm seeing this, what do you reckon? Like, what should we do to, you know, are there other solutions? It's almost trying to go around it in a solution-based rather than a challenging manner.
When you look at the sport, Dan, someone that's come from outside of it, so you've not grown up with gymnastics.
Yeah, absolutely.
At the highest level, there are a lot of big, serious injuries in gymnastics, right? Yeah. It's always knees, snapped Achilles, ankle ligaments. Yeah. There's a lot of them with a lot of the best athletes. Yeah. When you look from the outside, you know, in your opinion, is that in large part down to just the risk of the sport? Is it the strength and conditioning, the physical preparation? Is the ability to manage load?
Yeah. I think it's the risk of the sport.
Okay.
I think you know, the body goes through such high forces in gymnastics. I think it's anyone who does any sport, you know, at some point sometimes it's like an unfortunate thing that happens. You know, the things that are avoidable, you know, I think we've got to try and avoid those in terms of putting things in place. But there are sometimes things that happen where you're like, that sucks, and we couldn't have.
Yeah.
No one could have predicted that. And if we could, we'd all be driving different cars because, you know, every sport would want you on the planet. So it's really tough. And I think that's the age-old question. I think every sport is trying to figure that out, is how do we stop those injuries happening to the best athletes at the biggest moments, you know, at the best times. I think everyone's piling money into research into that. Okay. Sometimes you're just like, it sucks. Yeah. Sport's brutal. Yeah. It's so unforgiving.
You do a lot of your work down with female athletes within gymnastics, right? And I watched a video like 6 months ago, and it was on YouTube, and it was explaining why female footballers were, I think it was around 7 times more likely to do their cruciate ligament in their knee. And then it had a list of all the top female footballers in the world and how many of them have done their knee ligaments. Yeah. And it talked about the alignment of their hips and their knee. Can you explain that for me? Because I was really interested in that.
Yeah, of course, yeah. I used to work with that back in the day, Super League, the one below Super League. I used to work with Durham Wildcats when they first started. So, yeah, we had an ACL then, for example. It's the anatomy of the hip is a bit different. So you have something called a Q angle where the hip is actually wider, and then there's this sloping into the knee. Okay. And that sort of predisposes you to one of the key things that can cause an ACL injury, which is actually what we call knee valgus, so when the knee comes inwards.
So is that why when you work with a lot of kids, because I work with lots of kids, and typically I notice that the girls tend to do this more than the boys from a very young age. Yeah. When they land, their knees will go in together and they'll land like that.
Yeah, you see it a lot in most landings, but obviously as women develop and they go through puberty, obviously the hips get wider, so the Q angle becomes more pronounced. Okay. So I think that's why, obviously, at the top level of the game, where everyone has just matured and they're developed, and then they're playing at this high speed, this high level, you know, everyone's at that level now, they're probably more predisposed to it. Someone in that sport will answer that probably. Because I can imagine if you're an S&C coach in women's football now, that's something that you are fully focused on.
Yeah, that's probably a big focus for everybody, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the only thing I can probably attribute it to is I used to work a lot in netball. You'd have athletes that would go off into the Super League, and it's a similar thing. You know, a female athlete that has developed is strong, but their sport asks of them to stop on the spot. And obviously they're almost predisposed to that knee coming in a little bit. So again, that's another sport that actually gets a lot of ACLs, and you have to spend your time like religiously just looking after those knees.
How would you mitigate that? What kind of work, what muscles are you working on, and what exercises, what type of exercises are you working on?
You've got to be ungodly strong. Okay. To cope with the forces that you're putting your body through.
Everywhere around that knee?
Lower limb in general, just making sure you can actually like produce force, accept force. And then obviously making sure that like the chain itself is very organised. So we call it like neuromuscular control. It basically means like, can you organise your body the right way? So when you land, do you land and let everything just like move in? Yeah. Or do you land and are you organised enough to keep your knee in line and be able to keep your shoulders level? But again, you can do all of that work.
And it can still...
I've had it once where, unfortunately, bless her, a netballer's caught the ball, landed perfectly, but received a ball here and thrown a ball this way, which is a twisting action. And it's like, she's just done it because she's trying to move the ball through play quick. And I think that's one of those where sometimes you just got to be like, it sucks.
Are there any injuries within gymnastics that you notice that are kind of unique to the women's sport in comparison to the men's sport, and vice versa?
I think we'll probably...
Because they do different apparatus, right?
We're looking at probably like lower limb injuries in the girls that I work with.
So more lower limb.
Yeah, we're seeing more of that. And then obviously for the gents, I don't work with as many MAG programs, but obviously a bit of shoulder, elbow, wrist. bit of a theory that like we need to get this right to get everything else right for the lads. That's what we spend our time on. But yeah, I would say it is a bit of a split. But then everyone also has an ankle as well.
Okay.
So it's just soft surfaces, dismounting, high forces, fatigue. And the ankle is just the worst one because it can take such a long time and it doesn't feel like such a significant injury, but it can have such a knock-on effect.
I can remember having a conversation with Rudy, Dan, when the new floors came into gymnastics and they were a lot softer.
Right.
And there was a period of time where there were a lot of quite serious injuries, particularly with the women's side. And I asked him, like, why do you think that is? And he said, well, I believe it's not actually because... It's not the takeoff. It's because they're jumping higher because the floors are softer. Yeah. It's the impact on the landing.
Yeah.
Would that make sense?
Yeah. Well, Rudy knows his stuff, right? Yeah. So if he says it, take it as gospel. It would make sense, doesn't it? If you could jump higher, you would. Yeah. You're not going to tailor that. You're going to be like, I'm going to get more, so I have more time to produce more.
And is it just more force then coming back down on the other side?
You go, there's more force.
And it's that alignment when you're landing, then being in the right position, in the right place.
Yeah, and it was probably, if I was to guess at it, it would be that you were used to a certain level of force, and then it all changed, and
you weren't conditioned then to handle that sport.
It just changed.
Super interesting. Yeah.
Because then think about how many impacts you're doing on that surface all the time, and it adds up. It's a cumulative thing. So might not be this week, might not be next week, but eventually, that you're on like your rev counter. It's like, how long are you gonna do that? And it's really hard when surfaces change in any sport. Change a floor, change a pitch. There's always something that comes back. You normally find.
When you spoke, Dan, about managing that impact in gymnastics, because it is, and someone asked me actually the other day, it was a gymnast that trains at Notts, and he's a uni student, and he said, how have you found your body since retiring? I said, you know what, I feel better than ever. And he was like, why do you think that is? And I said, do you know what, I actually think that it's the force going through my nervous system, because when you hit a hard surface, it like vibrates through the whole of your body, and like your nervous system takes a pounding. And I was like, doing that every day for 6 hours, it just... not only takes something out of you physically, but like mentally and emotionally as well.
Absolutely.
I don't know whether there's any science to back it up, but that's the way that I felt. What can you do? Because I remember being at home training during the lockdown. Yeah. And when I came back in, my back just couldn't hit a springboard anymore.
Force was gone.
And so the second lockdown we had in that November, I would do every day outside on the concrete. I just do rebound jumps, to try and get my back used to that force. But you were talking about that increase in volume and the impact. What kind of work do you do to manage that ability for the athletes to take load? Are you doing more, or are you reducing the work they're doing in the gym?
It's trying to prepare them physically so they can cope. So the first thing is like, you don't change anything. You try and increase like what they can actually cope with to begin with, just to make sure that like it's not a physical limitation. So again, just making sure that rear chain has to be strong, because that's the thing that is coping with your landing. So we're talking about like hamstrings, glutes, upper back, core. It's all very interconnected, but you've got to strengthen that chain, because like you said, if that is weak, what happens is it doesn't go on the first landing or the third or the fourth, but over time it fatigues. And then when it fatigues, what happens is it then can't actually cope with the force, but you're still gonna produce the skill over and over. And that's the thing with gymnasts, is they're so talented that they can still do things when they're exhausted and the muscles probably aren't firing on all cylinders. So then they're still landing, but they're landing with a hamstring that is fatigued. So therefore they just start to just kick into the back more. And you don't want them to load the skeletal system. You want them to load the muscular and tendon and nervous system, right? That's the thing that drives the body. When it's tired, you're just going to load your skeleton. And then that's how you end up like that bad back. And like as soon as you lose that impact that you're used to as well, it takes a long time to build back up as well. It's not like it's not a quick fix. And you're absolutely right, like being obviously the level you were at as well, of like your nervous system takes a battering at training all the time. Like athletes are doing vaults where 20 times their body weight is going through them on a regular in training if they're hitting the springboard. And it's like your body's used to that all the time. But I can imagine there is an element of when you do stop that you almost feel fresher because it's not as fatigued all the time. Yeah. And your nervous system is like your central governor. It organises and controls everything. So it just has time to recover. Yeah. And the things you put it through are less stressful physically, maybe mentally and stuff. So obviously when you leave, you're never not stressed.
Yeah, when you have a child.
yeah. But it's a different thing. But for a fact now, for example, you haven't recovered from yesterday. Probably it's safe to say. But it's like it's that feeling, isn't it, of just that you're fatigued, but you've not slept. But you haven't done anything physically, but you're fatigued, right? Yeah. So I think the bigger importance is on recovery outside of the gym as well, right? Not the stuff in.
Yeah. So. Dan, what would you say to a club, a team, a coach, and how would you explain to them that they should prioritise S&C? How would you sell that to them?
I think it's allowing your athletes to reach their full potential. That doesn't mean that everyone's going to be an Olympian, but it's making sure that the athletes you've got that haven't got any physical limitations, that gives you the best opportunity to get what they want out of the sport. And therefore, as a byproduct, you're going to be able to have a gymnast who could potentially do more or feel safer, train harder. So one thing for S&C that's really not spoken about is if you're just physically better prepared, you have better training sessions. It's not just about the big hitting, like you can do this skill or not get injured. It's your day-to-day life. You get better training sessions because you're not having an athlete that comes in flying and then goes out crawling. They can actually cope with training, and then that means as a coach, the pressure's then on you to make the most of those sessions, right? And then that's when the conversation really starts, I think.
Do you fundamentally have a philosophy, Dan, when it comes to you approaching your strength and conditioning coach? And is there almost a key message that is interwoven into kind of everything that you do? Yeah,
I use that, obviously that encourage, enhance, protect. The big thing for me is the encourage bit. As time goes by in my coaching, it's spending more time on that social sciences stuff of how do you interact? How do you make people feel comfortable and bought in and understand their worries? So that's a big one for me, and I guess the philosophy that I go for is what we call a whole systems approach. So the body works as a whole system, and I think we need to get away from having a forearm day and a calf day. It needs to be more of a well thought out, structured approach, and that's what I'm sort of trying to drive with the clubs that I'm lucky enough to work with, and they're really bought into it as well. So I'm really fortunate in that sense.
Do you work in any other sports at the moment?
I don't. No.
Do you plan to or not?
No, I don't think so.
You think you're going to stay in gymnastics?
I think so, yeah. I think when I first started my consultancy, everyone was always saying, well, why don't you do more? And I was I want to work in a niche.
Okay.
And I think I found a sport.
You found it.
I think I found a sport where I can provide value. And that's what I sort of ended up leaving rugby for, if I'm being honest, was I was always the rugby guy. I was always going to go into rugby. And then I realised, I actually really don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to go work in a rugby club. So, but then I found gymnastics.
Yeah.
And actually, I feel valued, and I feel like the message is still developing. I don't think we're anywhere near done. I think we're just scratching the surface. I think at the top level, I think there's some amazing work being done, but I work with, obviously, the emerging elite, where any support is good support for them at the moment. So, yeah, I'm going to stay in gym.
That's good, because a lot of... A lot of people that are on the sports medicine side of things, they tend to use gymnastics for a CV because it's one of those sports where if you're a physio, right, you get to work with every type of injury because they're using their whole body.
Absolutely,
so if you go from, a lot of people tend to want to work in football, right? Because that's where a lot of the money's at. And a lot of people are football fans like me. I'd love to work in football too, but they will go to gymnastics because then when they come back to football, their CV then stands out. And if you've worked with an Olympic team, it's really interesting how, you spoke about it at the start. I quite often see, because I follow a lot of the physios and the leads for EIS who lead their teams, they're quite often advertising the same sports positions and they just can't get anyone to buy into them. But it's interesting how quite a lot of people come into gymnastics for 4 years and then they leave, and I'm always like, you spent 4 years.
You've just learned it.
we need that in the sport,
it takes a long time to learn it as well. So I talk about it's as if I just sat on the side of the tramp and watched a flip and twist and nailed it. To this day, I still don't understand things. And I'm just lucky that I can ask people and be like, I don't know what that is. I'm the first person to admit that I'm not a gymnast. I'm not from a gymnast background, but I work in gymnastics and I feel part of the community, but I'm still learning. it's really hard because I can imagine opportunities come up for people where they're almost sometimes too good to turn down.
Yeah.
But
have you had any of those opportunities yourself to go into
in
a
the
sport
past?
like football? Yeah.
Not in football. No, I've had like when I was in the Northeast, I had an offer for rugby, and I think that was when I realised I didn't want to do rugby.
Okay.
It's like I just weirdly said no to it, and I was like, oh,
that should be kind of the dream
I thought that was a yes.
Yeah.
But I think that's when I realised like maybe time to look at other sports and explore things, lose that title of like I'm a rugby guy or I'm a gymnastics guy. But yeah, I'm really happy in gym, and that's why I've set up my business. Is to support. The need is there, and I think at all levels, I think the need is there. Whether that's coach education or whether it's just making sure the gymnasts are getting the support that they want at all levels, because it's so demanding. It's so demanding on the athletes.
Do you have a long-term goal, Dan? I mean, it's quite easy, right, to imagine that an athlete would want to win a medal, or a coach would want to get an athlete to a competition. I can remember somebody, it was Josh actually once saying to me, he said, Sam, everybody's got an ego, even Sergey. And I was like, oh, yes, he does. And I was like, oh yeah, it's actually quite important to have that, because you need to want to progress and move forward and have some goals to work towards. As a strength and conditioning coach, do you have like an end goal that one day I'd love to work in this setting or be part of an Olympic team or whatever that might be? Does that exist? Is that important? Do you feel that's important, even as somebody that's working as a strength and conditioning coach or as a physio or a sports nutritionist?
Yeah, I think like as a coach, you're naturally still competitive. Like you're on the medical side, but you are classed as a coach. You have that like drive to the athletes I coach. Instantly, I just want them to be successful. Like I'm just really successful. Like I'm competitive in that sense. Like my own personal goals, I would like to go to an Olympics. I just think, for me, that's the thing I have most interest in. I think as I've gravitated away from team sport and I've sort of come into a sport where people are vying for the Olympics in terms of that's the top of their sport, that's something that I would like to, it's almost just an experience, because actually when I finish my career, what I'd like to do is look back on and go like, that was quite cool. Like to go and just be part of one, or I think that would be really interesting. But also, you know, from a business point of view, just making sure that I actually feel like I'm actually supporting gymnastics, and I think when that day stops where it feels like I'm not supporting gymnastics will probably be the day that I would go to something else. But at the moment, I feel the need is there, and I think everyone's very receptive to it as well. So yeah, I'm pretty lucky really that it's the sport I work in.
Can you envisage, Dan, a time in the near future maybe where you're going to have to, because the sport is changing and sport changes so fast, where you're going to have to pivot and maybe mould the way that you work? And does that make sense?
Yeah, it changes year on year. Like since I've started, what I do every year is changing, and I normally go sort of lock myself away in like a hotel room for a weekend to figure it out, if I'm honest. Of like, I have these review sessions where I'm like, that has to get better, or you missed this, or it's that reflective practice again. I had it drilled into me from like day one, so I think it's always at the end of a competition period, as coaches do, don't they? They go away and reflect. I think I do a lot of reflection of like, next year we should do this better, or so I'm in the middle at the moment, for example, having meetings with coaches about what are we going to do like in next year. So if it ever really pivots, like a massive pivot, I think everyone will have to jump and change and figure some things out. But year on year, I'm constantly trying to adapt, because if you don't, you're doing what you did 5 years ago, and you don't have 5 years experience. You're doing the same thing 5 years in a row, where you've got to get a little bit better as a coach every year. Otherwise, you don't have all this experience that people say. They just are repeating the same stuff.
Do you have a dream team, individual coach, or somebody that you would love to go and spend 6 weeks with and observe from the outside and just watch what they do?
I think
in any sport, not gymnastics in particular.
Yeah, I think going and experiencing. I'm a big believer in experiencing other sports and bringing it back to the one you work in. I'd be really interested to see these sort of NFL teams and how they run on a day-to-day. Just, 80 athletes, all high level, all millionaires, big support staff, all have their own needs. Like, how are you managing that? And then how are you managing all those staff as well? I think that's quite interesting, like that organisational structure. Okay. And then I think from like a gymnastics level, it's just work. I would love to just go and spend time with like a high-level team. Any nation, really. Just spending time, just learning and observing. Just go back to that, like sitting on the bench and getting educated again. because there's levels to all sport, isn't there? So I think doing that international stuff, I think would just be really interesting. And I think I'll come away again with lots where it's like, actually, if this is where they want to go, this is where we've got to get to.
How important do you think that is, Dan? Because I can remember when I was younger, I wanted to be a coach.
Yeah.
And I can remember my idea was, right, if I'm going to be a coach, I'm going to go to Japan for 6 months.
Awesome.
Just work there.
That's the spot.
Watch, learn. Then I'm going to go to Russia for 6 months.
Yeah.
Watch, learn. Yeah. Then I'll come back, then I'll start, which is a great fairy tale idea in principle. Yeah. Then I got a partner and
it's tough, isn't
there's
it?
no way I'm selling that. And also,
like,
coaching gymnastics in the traditional sense, for me, just wasn't going to work with like my lifestyle plans right now. One day in the future it will. Yeah. Do you feel like maybe now, like how do you know, and do you think there maybe would come a point where you'd go, right, I've been doing this now for 10 years, 15 years, you know, I've got to a level where I'm pretty comfortable, pretty happy where I'm at, confident with the knowledge that I'm bringing and the value I'm providing. Maybe I need to stretch myself, go somewhere that's a bit alien, and try and grow a little bit. Do you think that's something maybe you would do one day?
Yeah, it's always there, isn't it? It's that like, lingering, like I could do a bit more somewhere. I think so, yeah. Again, it's I really enjoy what I do now in the sense of, because I feel like it's needed and provides the value, I think I said earlier. But, you know, if an opportunity that was very interesting came up, I think you would naturally almost have to step and see. It would be it's a hard call though, because like you said, what I'm doing now is almost stretching me at that point still, because I've come out of that like almost employed environment, rugby environment, to then gym self-employed environment. So it's already happening really. When you run a business, like as you know, it's you get stretched quite a lot, quite on a daily basis really, whether that's work or projects or whatever that is that you've got going on.
What advice would you give to someone, Dan, that's looking to get into S&C, that maybe was that 16-year-old like you that had a conversation with someone and has an interest for sport but doesn't necessarily think they want to compete or coach? What advice would you give them? And also, after you've answered that, what advice would you give someone like me that has recently, in the last 18 months, essentially gone freelance and worked for myself and is building my own business? I'm at a point now where I'm struggling to manage the amount of work coming in, and I'm finding that hard.
It's tough.
How do you do that? Do you have systems in place to manage that? So I know that's two long questions there. So let's start with the first one, which was the advice to a young Dan, essentially, someone that wanted to get into S&C.
The industry's changed a lot, so it is diluted. There's a lot of people trying to do it now. Sounds like a cool job, right? So I think everyone is doing it. What I would say is that puts a lot of people off now, because they say, oh, it's so diluted, and you know, you'll have to do multiple internships and it's going to be a slog. But for me, it's like, if that's something you want to do, don't let that put you off. Just go be great, go be better at everyone on your internship, and just make sure you're the one that secures a job, which sounds a bit cutthroat, but don't let someone say that just because something's diluted, you shouldn't do it, because what's your other alternative? You're going to do something you don't want to do. So that's the first one. And also, like, learn and be a sponge, and not everything everyone says to you is a criticism. So when I was a young coach, it's quite hard to get told stuff, but I was in an environment like Durham where like you were getting told stuff regularly, and it was taken personally. And then once I stopped taking it personally, taking it as advice, you sort of realise that some of these older coaches do kind of know what they're on about, right? So that's what I would say really, is go for it if that's what you want to do. Reach out to me if that is something you want to do, because I'll help you with it. And then, like you said, once you're in that environment, learn everything, ask questions, don't be lazy, turn up on time, be respectful, just all the basic things that are going to get you well liked in an environment. I've had interns that turn up late, don't do the reading, things like that, and you're naturally just not going to help those guys as much as the ones that are reading, turning up, doing extra. You know, it's one of those things where you do just have to do that.
And then that second one, mate, about the
it's hard, huh? It's I'm quite organised and structured, like in terms of that's what stops me getting stressed. And if it's not structured, it's stressful. So for example, like being all open and honest, January to now hasn't been that structured. It's been quite stressful. For me, it's just being as structured as you humanly can. And if that means you have to take time to structure what's coming,
say no to work so that you've got that time to...
create the structure. And then when you first start things, it's really easy to like say yes to almost everything, and it feels really good because you're like, this business is growing. And then you realise it's just you, and you're like, how do I actually do all of this? So for me, it's being more selective, being brave enough to say no in the right way, and almost just enjoy it as well. Like, make sure you enjoy the bit of like when it's growing, because I don't think I enjoyed mine. I think I was genuinely racing to the point of now, and then when you get to the point here, I think all I'm doing is looking like for the next 5 years, where if I could go back, I would probably enjoy the fact of like going into clubs for the first time again and meeting people for the first time and grinding on podcasts and reading all the time because I didn't know anything, and enjoy that bit. And just sometimes it just feels overwhelming, and I think that's also the other side of it, is let it feel a bit overwhelming. And also, if any business person tells you that they don't feel overwhelmed, but at least once a week, they're lying, they're bullshitting. So, well, in my case, but everyone I speak to, when you actually ask them, do you find this quite overwhelming? Like, people who are good in business or high level, like, realize they just don't tell people.
Just learning to manage that.
Yeah, they just don't outwardly say it. Yeah. But I think, there's a podcast, I'll send it to you, which is a guy called Richard Hassini, who interviews all of these high-level coaches or people of positions of influence in sport, and it's all to do with their like mental health and overwhelm, and what you soon realise is like, oh my god, that guy works with Formula One athletes and he still gets overwhelmed like he was an intern. It's crazy, but I think it's just very common. People don't talk about it.
Amazing, mate.
Thank you.
I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation.
No, it was awesome. Thank you for having me on.
You're top man. And where can people go if they are interested? We obviously have our base is predominantly gymnastics fans.
Cool.
We do have a lot of people that follow from other sports and people that are just interested in the guests. But if someone is interested in S&C coaching, where do they go to?
Yeah, just Dan Lonsdale SC on Instagram is probably the easiest place.
They can contact you directly.
Contact me directly, and then we'll just jump on a phone call quick as possible. If not, an email, which is just dan@danlonsdale.com as well.
Amazing.
Yeah, thank
top
you.
Man. Thank you.
Cheers, bud.